Hello again everyone, Ren here, hoping you had a splendid time during the holiday. The goal of this year is to post more endgame studies, no matter how people might despise it. After watching Firuza and Nair endgame just last year, and also the Game 6 of the World Championship game, it is impossible not to be dreaded by the stage of the game that we will inevitably encounter. So let's make it our goal to improve our endgame, shall we? The theme today is Advanced King Pawn Endgame, mainly because I've made this video before, using only a few examples. So if you haven't seen it, please check that out. That contains every basic that you need for King Pawn Endgame. But for 3 to 4 puzzles today, think of it as an advanced practice to prep for rainy days, as this will be practical and also be quite common for us to meet in our day-to-day game. Very quickly for the first example, as you can see with 1 pawn each, it is white to move and to win. It might seem impossible at the first glance to win, because after pawn to b4, we can just take, and that seems like a draw for us. But would you like to pause the video to find out more how to win this game? I thought this would be a good practice for anyone who would like to pause the video and try this out. Give you a couple of seconds. Right, so the obvious king to c3 to go king to b4 and gobble up this pawn doesn't really work, just because here black can play pawn to a3, and you might think that pawn takes on a3 is winning, but it is at this moment that black can storm his king all the way back to b8 and a8 to defend. And the fact this pawn is actually a rook pawn, meaning that the pawn that is standing on the A file and or the H file doesn't help white in the winning chances at all. We talked about this in the previous video as well, where the rook pawn doesn't really have a chance, except for the fact that it has a rook, supporting it to push forward. Now I might try king to b4, but then king to d6, king to b5, king to c7, king to a6, king to b8, and king to b6. You might think that we have the opposition, and therefore we can start to push the pawns. And just because the pawn on a3 is a rook pawn, the king can stuck itself on a8 and defend the b8 square simultaneously to stop the pawn from promotion. We can play this position out, but there's no way that white can actually break through. And after pawn to a7 check, king to a8, there will be no square that the white king can step onto, and it's not a draw. For example, king to a6 is stalemate, the king is trapped in the corner of the board, and if king to c7, obviously king takes on a7, and that is a draw as well. So hopefully that is clear. If you push pawn to b4 here, obviously you can do that as well, but this is also a draw. After pawn to a2, you have to spend a couple of tempo in fact, to save this pawn from promoting, but by then it'll be too late. Now king to e5, king to b2, king d5, king b3. Again, we'll talk about this in the first video as well. The king is behind his pawn, not the ideal setup for you to promote the pawn and to win. The black king can play king to c6, king to b5, king to b6 to just shoulder the white king and the pawn from promoting. This will be a draw as well for black. Turns out the only way to win this position as white is to underdevelop your king to b1, as surprising as it might sound. But the core ideas and the principles are very much the same, and that is to find a way for the king to run to at least 2 square up the board before it can push the pawn to promote. But at the same time, to stop this pawn from promoting on the a file. So black can still play pawn to a3, but we're going to ignore that playing pawn to b3. And by the way, not pawn to b4, because that will be over pushing the pawn. Black can start chasing it, and no matter how we see it, it's going to be ending in the same position where the king is behind his pawn, and this will be a draw for white. So again, pawn to b3 to preserve an important tempo. The critical difference to the position prior to this one is that no matter how black can chase this pawn, we will be able to remain one step forward from this b pawn, and this position is winning for white. Now if you can imagine, if the pawn were on b4, this position will still be a draw. So again, the king has to be in front of the pawn to guarantee enough space for the pawn to promote. This is a winning endgame for white. We can even play this out. If king to b6 with king to b4, now we have the opposition, and the king will be forced to step back. For example, king to c6, king to a5, we made a progress. King to c7, even better. We go king to b5, and if king to b7, we push our pawn, and hey, we have the same opposition again against the black king, and this will be a winning endgame. King c7, king a6, we can push this pawn forward. This will be a winning endgame. But never there's one thought that to win this position, one has to throw away all the chess principle that they have, underdeveloping the king to b1, and when encountering the opportunity to win the pawn, he doesn't take it, because this will be a draw. So this is the general goal of this video, is to add another layer of perspective to the king and pawn endgame. So obviously we'll make a better informed decision next time we met one. The second puzzle is similar to the first one in that we only have to care about the opposition of the king, and we can throw away the rest of the principle. This puzzle might not be very beginner friendly, but I think there's a shortcut to this anyway. Would you like to pause the video to find out yourself? Now again, as a quick analysis will show, it would have been better if white had stormed all the way up the board and tried to take this pawn while it can, right? But what's interesting is after king to h6, suddenly white does not have a good square to go to. Any square that he retreated to will have meant that the pawn will be lost on g6 and black pawn will start to push on the g file and black will be winning. And so if you look at it from this perspective, you cannot be the one who touches the base pawn first, because then black will have the time to defend this and you'll have to be forced away. If we shift to this position a bit, and it is white to move, this will be winning for white, because after king to f7, it is black's turn to move, and he'll be forced to move from the defense of this pawn. And any square that he goes to, that will mean that he loses the pawn on g7, and he'll be able to push the pawn to victory. However, after king to f7, king h6, and it is white's turn to move, this will be losing for white. This is not the way to go. And so for those who does not know how to visualize this correctly, there is a simpler way to calculate this, and that is by using a simple math. And it's very simple. You compare the number of steps that you need for the king to get to this pawn, and the steps that your opponents need to get to this pawn. And if the number of the steps is the same, you have a very big chance to lose the endgame. To win it, you have to be one tempo short. Let's say if the king can reach here within 4 moves, the white king will win. But then the amount of steps that the white king needs and the amount of steps the black king needs is the same number of 5, and therefore white will actually lose this position. But that's the general principle after all. But how do you defend this position anyway? Is there a way to win or to draw at all? Turns out this position is only a draw. This is no way for white to win, and the move starts with either king to b2 or king to b1. Either way, it's not really going to save this pawn, it's going to sacrifice it. And even though if black can get to this pawn, white will be able to maintain an opposition that is needed to draw the game. As you can see, white steps in front of the king, 1 file away from the king to be exact, to claim the draw position. And everywhere he goes, we follow.
He loves me, he loves me, he loves me, and where I go he'll follow, he'll follow, he'll follow.
Okay, that's enough fun for now. But you still have to remember, the opposition is only by 1 square or by 1 file. If in this position instead you have chosen to play king to f4, then suddenly black has the opposition and black wins. Now you have to take note of that one. So you have to be careful. You are the one who has to hold off the opposition, not your opponent, since you won the draw. The third curated position is notorious for its difficulty, but is practical and common, so much so that it always reappears in endgame books and or puzzles in high similarity but with the very same concept. And because it's very difficult, I'm just going to go ahead and show you the solution. And to start, it's not very hard to say that even Donkey knows that the king has to move away from the file to let the pawn promote. But the better question is, where to? But it's so practical and common that it always reappears in endgame books or puzzle with high similarity, but with the very same concept. And the idea is that we have to stop this pawn from promoting, performing the opposition, while also try to shoulder the king away to touch the c8 square or b8 square. Obviously, when he reaches to c8 and b8, there'll be no way where you can push the pawn without losing it in the end of the game. So there's a combination of several principles right there, and the movement of the king has to do with it. And if you guys had guessed king to c5, then you are in the right track of winning the game. Now let's just review very quickly why king c4 will be a fail in this game. It turns out the idea will not to be pushing the pawn forward, because then while we win the race, the king is closer to the promotion square. And if you're not familiar with the concept of square, it is basically the number of squares that the pawn needs to promote and the number of squares that the king needs to basically stop it. And if your king and the pawn is inside the square, as we draw it, your king will be able to stop it. You don't even have to calculate or visualize it. So this is basically the shortcut number 2 to basically understand whether or not you can stop the pawn. But either way, this is not the idea because the king is in the square. The idea, however, for black is king to g5. This is a surprising idea because again, as we talk about, he wants to get into the d8 square, c8 square, and in the end b8 square to stop the pawn from promoting. We can try play king c5, but then king f6, king c7, c6, then king to e7. There's no way that we can stop them from coming to d8. And even though king to c7 here, to stop the king from coming to d8 and to push our pawns, let's not forget that black also has his passed pawn. He can start pushing as well. And when both sides try to push and to promote, they both have the same queen, and this position will be a clear draw. But the surprising move king to c5, drawing the king away, from the promotion square, knowing that you still have enough. If pawn to g5 right here, then we can push the pawn to b4, and if pawn to g4, we play king to d4. Again, the question is, are we inside the square? We are. And so therefore, we can actually stop this pawn while pushing this pawn to promote. This position will be winning for us. The black king is too far away from the white pawn, and this will be winning for us. And if king to g6, again just to stop our pawn by getting into d8, then we don't really care, do we? Because now we have the tempo already pocketed by playing king to c5 instead of king to c4. And even after king to f7 or f6, we can push king to e7, king c6, and with king d8, we can even afford king to b7 and king to a8, just because how fast our pawn is on b5. He can push pawn to g5, doesn't matter, but after b6, let's say g4, we can play king to a7 and or king to a6, king to a8, doesn't even matter, and then push the pawn to victory. Let's just put that on the board right now. If g3, g7, g2, we have a queen, and obviously we'll be able to stop that pawn by playing queen to g3. This would be game over for black and we win the game. And so that is why I can see that the move king to c5 is very important. It serves to defend this position, and it serves to devoid the opposition that black might have when it comes to d8 or c8. Now before we wrap up this video, I want to throw you the last position that I think will be fun to solve. Mainly because I threw the concept of squares in front of you earlier. This is a fun one to solve. At the first glance, you can see that black only needs 4 squares to promote. And so if you draw a square like this, there'll be no way that white can stop this pawn, and black's going to be the one who wins this, just because he's short of 2 to 3 tempos to be inside the square to stop this pawn. However, the short of 2 tempos will be covered by the white pawn right here, if it can make it to queen. Also, it might just seem impossible because the king is so close to the pawn, and it can stop it from promotion. But that is basically the key answer. Black has to spend another 2 tempos to stop this pawn, or it can use it to basically chase this pawn, and this will be a draw. The move will be king to g7 for white. And if pawn to h4, running forward to actually promote, we go king to f6. And if king to b6 try to stop the pawn, we play king to e5. We're still technically not in the square, and if black pushes, he might promote, but then we can play king to e5 to protect this pawn. We go c7, h1 queen, we go c8 queen, and this position is a draw. Mainly after queen to h2, we can go king to d7, and so on. But let's just say if black takes the pawn on c6, then we are, in fact, in the square, and we can stop this pawn from promotion. This position will be a draw for white. It's crazy how white can basically save this game by using the concept of lateral move, and that's by moving your king diagonally to make it seem like it moves faster. But the concept is not only to stop this pawn, but also to help promote your pawn so that the king will lose the important tempo that you will need to save the game. So that's all the puzzles for today. Hopefully you have a fun one. Hopefully you learned something from this video and you have a change of perspective on how you approach your endgame. Again, 4 puzzles always might not be enough, but there always will be puzzles of the like if you purchase an endgame book. And even a simple tactical trainer online will help you to get very far king and pawn endgame if you're willing to put in the time and effort. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed it, if you've learned something and has changed your approach to the endgame, please consider pressing the like button. I'll appreciate it a lot. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon. Thanks for watching.